want to welcome all of you to our Welcoming the Stranger, the Racial Impact of U.S. Immigration Policy and the Call of the Church. This is presented by Sojourners, the Commission on Mission and Social Justice, and the Taskforce on Antiracism. This is our third session. How do I go down? Okay, how can I go down? Why am I not moving forward? Next, okay. So we're going to look at a couple of things following the format we have in the previous sessions. And at this point, I just wanted to acknowledge my co-presenters, Craig Limley, Linda Fenneman, Samati Devadetti, sorry about that, and Emily Anderson. And I also wanted to acknowledge those in this group and their families who are immigrants to this country. Many of you from the Caribbean island countries and from Africa who have faced painful discrimination over the course of your lives. And I want to thank you for sharing your stories and for your perseverance and the gifts that you have brought to your families and to all of us. Okay, keep going. So we are on land that belonged to which was the Lenape people, belonged to the Lenape people. And we are bound with them in a complex history, a shared geography, and an appreciation of this land. I just wanted to share a couple of more comments about them. This comes from the book of Unconformities, Speculations on Lost Time by an English writer, Hugh Raffles. It's a difficult book, but there are a couple of points here that I found quite interesting. When Henry Hudson arrived in the New York harbor in the fall of 1607, he found a people who had been here on this land for 11,000 years, or at least their ancestors had. And a few points he makes. These were individuals, these were groups of people who made decisions by consensus and were committed to the reciprocity in individual liberty and religious belief. They cultivated widespread networks that were formed from invisible lines of kinship, marriage, friendship, commerce, and grievance that linked the many villages of the region into alliances that eschewed a soul leader. It was a network structured by three powerful matrilineal classes, the turtles, the turkeys, and the wolf, in which women selected the leaders and held in trust the clan's lands and houses. These Manhattan Lenape knew that all things have spirits and are innately alive and can exert influences on the things around them. They saw themselves as an integral part of a natural world filled with an infinite variety of plants, animals, insects, clouds, water, stones, each of which possess spirits no less important than those of human beings. And they understood that everything is able to share or confer this spiritual power to we humans to help us in our lives. Okay, so our class covenant we've gone over and hopefully you've all read it, and I'll just point out a few things, but basically we wanted to emphasize that we value and affirm the positive values and the contributions of a diversity of people of different ethnicities and cultures and genders and sexual orientations, that we entered the space with curiosity and humility, that we want to speak as briefly as possible so that others can have an opportunity to speak, to honor the opinions of others, to treat others with respect, caring, and kindness, to keep this discussion on topic, and to seek and develop a sense of community within this group. Our scripture for this particular session comes from 1 Chronicles 16, verses 19 to 22. When they were few in number, of little account and strangers in the land, wandering from nation to nation, from one kingdom to another people, he allowed no one to oppress them. He rebuked kings on their account, saying, "Do not touch my anointed ones. Do my prophets no harm." Okay, just a quick, can you all see that? A quick overview of the US immigration policy that we've discussed in week 1 and 2, kind of how we got there, before I hand this over to the post 9/11 problems and etc. So legally, we began with what was called the Nationality Act of 1790, which defined the eligibility for citizenship for free white people / males. Since our founding in this country, we've all too often and consistently been, as Dr. Letzum called in her sermon today, destroyers of the deliverers of dreams, as we've maintained laws, policies, and a mental state of mind, which mostly excluded non-Northern European people. Settlers, historians, politicians, and good people over the centuries saw this land as our land, driven by a notion of infinite manifest destiny, of frontiers which could and should expand endlessly, and that people already here are people not of the founder's ethnicity and seeking to come here were expendable. So when we needed cheap labor and our economy was booming, we accepted immigrants. We brought in the Chinese to build our railroads and mine our Western mountains, and then excluded them in 1882 and many times thereafter. In our first attempt to target by race and class a particular group of people. We accepted Mexicans and those who had lived on this land and moved freely across the southern border for generations to work on our farms and elsewhere. And we courted them for short contracts in the Bracero Agreement between 1942 and 1964. But we also deported 1 million under Eisenhower in what was called the Operation Wetback. We welcomed Germans and Irish, Italians and others to fill our cities, run our factories and sweatshops, start farms. And today we have generations of migrants filling essential jobs and those that enable the lives of the rest of us, jobs that US-born people are not taking for reasons of age, education, low wages, or location. And when it was politically expedient to admit certain nationalities in our fight against communism, we admitted them. But in periods of whipped up xenophobia, concerned with anarchists and other undesirables, afraid they might enter, we barred them. Or with the 1919-1920 Palmer raids by the Department of Justice, we rounded them up and deported them as anarchists and left-wing radicals. And of course, we even disenfranchised our own citizens, as in the detention of the Japanese American during World War II, as we had for centuries of the African Americans and Native peoples. So there are many, many pieces of legislation. I won't go into all of this. When I tried to write it all down, I had a 35-minute presentation. So let's go quickly to the 1924 Immigration Act, which was our primary means of determining immigration admissibility into the United States until 1965. And it established extended national quota systems, highly restrictive and discriminatory system. Yet in the same year, for labor purposes, we put no cap on immigration within the American hemisphere, and the Border Patrol was authorized. Then came the Nationality and Immigration Nationality Act of 1965, when we did see major changes and many positive. It applied a system of preferences for family reunification. That was 75% of those being allowed in, employment, 20%, and refugees, 5%. And for the first time, we capped immigration from the Americas. And there were many other efforts. The launching of the I-1B visa, which brought in very high-skilled temporary workers in 1990, the Flores settlement, which established a treatment and release, a humane treatment and release of unaccompanied immigrant children in detention. And they were two very positive things, because through this whole century, the assumption was that people came here to work for a while and then they would go away, or they wanted to stay here, or they had already been here for a long time, and that we wanted them to be able to regulate their status and become citizens. And this was possible as long as we had the Registry Act, which was renewed over and over again until 1972 when it stalled. And also during this time, most people recognized, because we are a nation of immigrants, that immigrants were plus to the country. And we led the world for a long time there, for a period of a decade or two, in welcoming people, refugees from all over the world. So what happened? Well, excuse me. What happened was that with the change in demographics, we also saw a flare up again of the xenophobia, of this intense anti-immigrant behavior, of just basically having political trolls because of the shift in demographics. And this happened mostly in the 80s and 90s. We had influential, well-financed groups such as the Center for Immigration Studies, the Federation for American Immigration Reform, and although they've all been, and others, which were classified as hate groups, but still prosper and hold politicians under their thumb, as they do the media. And then, and this is my last thing, then came the Clinton's laws. Samati mentioned these last weeks and did a good job of introducing them, but their effect was so radical. Their effect was so heinous that I can't say enough about them. In the 1990s, when violent crime was at a historic height, Clinton made the radical move of turning immigrants and immigration into problems to be solved through crime control. So we had the US border beginning Operation Gatekeeper to deter unauthorized crossings. This resulted in some 7,000 deaths and outsourced anti-immigrant violence to criminal traffickers and to the natural forces that make deserts deadly. Clinton excluded immigrants from most forms of public assistance and ended funds for legal representation for undocumented immigrants with the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act in 1996. And this was followed by two horrific laws, the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, which created a direct pipeline from the US criminal punishment system into the immigration enforcement apparatus, and the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act, which exploded the list of minor crimes, and those which are all misdemeanors for citizens were now classified as aggravated felons, and they could mandate grounds for automatic removal, i.e. deportation. So among these other things that these laws did, they expanded the laws for deportation to include nearly any crime. They stripped judges for immigrants. They stripped judges of the ability to consider life circumstances in order to grant pardons on a case-by-case basis. They ignored the fact that deportation is a civic, not a criminal proceeding. And they subjected newcomers, undocumented asylum seekers, to fast-track deportation, in which officers could expel immigrants without any hearing from a judge. And of course, these mandated more money for enforcement, as well as for a wall, and fueled an explosion and a huge leap in deportation and enforcement, which brings us, Craig, are you ready? To 2001 and the events of 9/11, the establishment of the Department of Homeland Security and its onerous, expanded, and unregulated agencies, the further vilifying of immigrants, and in 2016, the election of our 45th president. Greg, thank you. You're mute.
Please.
Okay.
The seventh chapter in Dr. Cohen's book is aptly named Nervous Breakdown. And I think when you look, this was, in my mind, a gift to nativists, to white supremacists, to anti-immigrant groups, like the ones we just talked about, the Federal American Immigration Reform and CIS, and groups that really did a good job of manipulating the American public and change our perspective from our history of, welcoming immigrants to, oh, these are, as Donald said, criminals, rapists, all this nonsense. So it was a chance for those groups to exert even more influence and convince many of us that we need to do something about our immigration problem. They're terrorists, they're scary people, they're different, they're other. And we had the Terrorist Act in 1993, which had some effect with those two laws that Clinton proposed, along with, crime legislation, which, both in immigration and in our incarceration systems have create an explosion of incarcerating or detaining people at great expense in both of those. And I think great harm to us as a nation, to our psyche, to what we'd like to think we stand for in terms of who we are and how people can succeed in this country. We've really sort of broken a commitment to ourselves. 9/11 generated a very hasty response, a massive reorganization of the government. It's the largest since after World War II, a reorganization of the Department of Defense into one thing. That was, in, as I said, 1947. The purpose for this was theoretically to enhance national security from terrorism. And like the law in 1965, some of the intent there was very similar. Thank you. I've babbling and forgot to say the next page. So all those came together to create this situation. It consumed a large amount of resources. The budgeting, as we'll talk about later, just grew exponentially and continues to grow. It is, as is mentioned in the book, the largest law enforcement group in the American government. It's larger than every other law enforcement. It's larger than the FBI and the CIA and the tobacco and firearms people. And this budget's much larger. And they also then take money from FEMA and from the Army to expand this group when we have fewer people coming into the country, whether it's across a border or coming at our airports to immigrate or overstay their visas. So we're spending more and more money. We have more and more people to work with less and less, of, I will say in parentheses, the problem, are people who are immigrants who are not documented. I don't like to use the term illegal because personally, I don't think people are illegal. So this reform created the Department of Homeland Security. So Immigration and Naturalization Services, which obviously from its title sounds like it works more on how do you help people immigrate and become citizens to, how do we maintain security? So you had a small group that was called the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. Then you had Custom and Border Protection, which folded in all the problems and the heritage and the culture of Custom and Border Patrols, which was along the southern borders, which created many atrocities over time. And, again, with all these groups, we sort of supersized enforcement, which doesn't always work. Can we go to the next slide? So with that reorganization, just to sort of continue that, ICE was also set up in immigration custom enforcement, and they had enforcement and removal operations under that, and the Homeland Security investigative thing. So you would think with the Homeland Security, you would be working a lot more with terrorism, but actually, if you look at their current budgets, their recent budgets, about 90% of their budget is also looking at enforcement. So we've gone from this focus of how do we prevent terrorism to how do we enforce these draconian laws we now have in place? How do we get anybody and everybody that's an undocumented immigrant? And it doesn't matter if we pick up a few US citizens because they're probably others, so we might as well move them out. I mean, that mission sort of shifted from this terrorism prevention to removing immigrants. And through all of this, it's dangerous, cruel, inhumane, expensive, unrestrained, and they would not respond to congressional oversight. So it's all kind of a really frightening situation that we're looking at here. And I don't think we always realize how frightening it is. And I'm reminded of what happened on January the 6th in this country. And if I think you'd ask most people the day before if they were thought something else would happen, I think they'd probably say no, but it has and it did. So it shows you when some people develop powerful messages, it can really have a strong effect more than some of us would like to think. You can go to the next slide. If you look at the ICE and Custom and Border Protection budgets, in 2019, that had expanded to $25 billion. Spending is unrestrained. They're giving money to private corporations. These corporations are making massive profits. The two biggest ones are Core Civic and the Geo Group. They also are involved in incarceration prisons also. So they've really, sort of made their niche, and they take this money and for immigration, they try to focus on the subcommittee that develops the budget for Department of Homeland Security. There's a lot of effort, a lot of money, a lot of time and lobbying focused on the Congress people that can impact their budgets. And again, as I mentioned before, they're also taking money from the Army, and they're taking money from FEMA to overspend every year. So let's go to the next slide. This is looking at part of the Border Patrol budget. And you can just see, this doesn't outline everything, but just one small component of how rapidly and how much it's grown. And, you know, if this money were refocused towards communities, or at least partially towards communities, I really think it could have a strong impact on what the reality could be for people who are trying to come into this country and contribute to our society, or who are already here and contributing. We can go to the next slide. I'm going to step through some of the things that has happened in the Trump era. I don't know if these were all talked about in the book, but I think it's kind of important to look at where we are now. And later in this presentation, I'll also talk about some of the things that are happening or in process with the Biden group, and some things we could consider to maybe help support some of those things. One of the most horrific recently along the southern border, you know, after they used the Army in 2018 to do barbed wire and wire fences across the border, and they were given authority to shoot to kill if they felt threatened in any way. And that was mostly to help Republicans during the midterm elections in 2018. After that, they set up migration protection protocols because, and you know, with the COVID pandemic, they've strengthened that. So people that want to come into the US, we don't do the interviews here, we send them back to Mexico, and they're just in refugee camps, which have very little support. The Attorney General's ruled that you can't use what happens to you as an individual, like if you're being attacked by gangs, or your husband's abusive, or your wife's abusive, or something like that, you can't use that as an excuse to come into this country, whereas in the past, that could be considered. And it used to be that if you were going to be deported back to your home country had to authorize that. What they've done is a safe third country rule. So if that person's country won't take it back, ICE will try to find you another country to go to. And they can keep you locked up as they try to do that. And this made it like, you know, after the third country doesn't work, then we'll try a fourth country. And then you could this person could be locked up literally for the rest of their lives while we played around trying to find another country to take them. And the tactic with ICE is find countries that they probably wouldn't want to take them. As I talked about before, we militarized the southern border. And, you know, when we did get people that we get, you know, some of the judges would have given refugee status to get them resettled. Now it requires that state and wherever you're going to put that person in the local area has to consent to that. So that creates another hardship because not everybody wants to allow other people in. Now there are areas in the country where they recognize the value of immigrants and they need the labor, and it can become, that can happen, but this just delays the whole process. So the other tactic is always, you know, how can we make this more expensive for the immigrant? How can we delay their entry into the life of our country? We now are charging asylum applicants. People are getting their green cards, that sort of thing, filing fees, and they keep increasing. In fact, the last increase was denied by courts recently. I know our group, Sojourners, has worked with people who've been released, and we're finding now recent people who've been released are not getting their ID when they get discharged, and they're not getting their working papers right away. So they're delaying that. So you get somebody who's out who has no ID, who's walking on the street. Like if I try to send them a check, they can't cash it because nobody knows who they are. And they can't look for work because they don't have that permit. They need that in order to get a Social Security card. The State Department gets engaged in politically interfering with people like Francis and I, who are helping and working and supporting with these people. Immigration courts, they've put in new judges who have come from Department of Homeland Security, with obviously this focus on enforcement and deporting people. They worked very hard to prevent people from coming into the country and to deter them from coming in. That's why, they did things like the childhood separation. They often will publicize information that is incorrect, or as I like to call them, lies. Francis, next page. There was a question about this. This is the link for the entire article, and it's in the presentation we sent you. It's also in the resource page that we gave you. Later today, I will send you a link so you can also get to the presentations. We hope to have the recordings up at that same link, so you can listen to these presentations as we speak them. The resource page will be there also, but I strongly recommend it. Next slide, please. I just remind you, this is sort of one illegal act of someone has managed to enter without legal documentation. There's, bless you, Diane. There's no statute of limitations. I question, and it's talked about in this book, is this a civil misdemeanor or a crime? Are these people given due process and how they got in here, why they got in here, or why they want to come? What is their refugee status? When do you become a citizen in this country? When the country was first founded, all those white males got all swept in at once, and it took a lot of other people a long time to fight for their rights and become citizens. We have approximately 10 million people in this country who are undocumented. I contend, and I think Dr. Cohen and several people in this room would contend, that they are Americans. It's like, how do we document and allow them to become citizens? They contribute to our society. They offer value. They do jobs that other people don't do. They have skill sets that we find valuable, and we let them come in on visas. For the people who are undocumented, one study showed that if we had a system to convert them to citizenship, or to allow them to get a green card at least, their salaries would go up about 25% on average, and it would add about $1.4 trillion to the GDP of this country. So there's a value in doing this. It's a value in normalizing these people. Half of these people are in households with children, so they're supporting them. They're paying taxes. They're contributing to society. There needs to be a new registry date or length of time or automatic adjustment. Next page. And again, I just talked about these, but these are some of the things that Dr. Cohen recommends: that we revive the statute of limitations, reverse the Clinton era laws that we talked about that really set things up so we could supersize things after 9/11. Or actually, Donald Trump did the supersizing and I'll talk through we've talked through some of the things that he has done. I think we should eliminate detention of immigrants. I don't think it's effective. We need to develop community-based case management of immigrants and asylum seekers. I think with questions I sent you, I also attached a file that was called How to Talk. And I would recommend that you kind of look that over. That can give you a way of talking with other people. The next page.
That's also in the resources too.
Right. The ACLU, before the inauguration, had a list of things they felt should be our priorities for the Biden administration, because there, as you all know, a lot of cleanup work that needs to be done after Trump. Some of the immigration policy recommendations they have are listed here. Rescind the Muslim ban, which has happened, and immigration detention as we know it. I know there's discussion with not using private prison companies anymore for incarceration, and I think that could be folded over to look at immigration also. We need to cut the budgets for Custom and Border Patrol and for ICE and hold them accountable for the human rights abuses. They've gotten a waiver from the Supreme Court that they don't have to follow the Constitution. We've seen the impact of that on how it's also we've got this large paramilitary force that's giving military style weapons. They're being trained on them. And you look at some of the things that happened in Portland when unidentified federal agents came into that city, And we saw it again in front of the White House when Donald needed to have his picture taken in front of a church, how peaceful protesters were rounded up and pushed out of the way. And I think also Biden tried to implement a moratorium, and a federal judge in Texas has stopped that.
Okay.
So hopefully we can continue to define that. Militarizing the border communities is just not effective. We try to do enforcement, that doesn't work. We need to sort of figure out a way to humanize and again, address some of the problems that are going on in Central and South America. And I think, again, that's a thing that's going to be a focus of the Biden administration. We need to implement administrative relief to protect undocumented people and stateless people from deportation so they can have an opportunity to work with attorneys and fight for their citizenship, and we should be fighting for citizenship for all. And restore access to citizenship and immigration benefits rather than saying no to everything. Next page. Biden's immigration reform bill, which I thought was a very good, very strong thing, has a pathway to citizenship in it. It changes the immigration court system, so there'll be some due process going on. Now ICE can pick somebody up and literally just ship them out of the country without anyone looking at that person's case. We need to be more sophisticated in border security. A wall doesn't fix our border. And as I mentioned before, addressing the causes of migration, looking at things that are going on in the south of the border here, and streamlining the legal system so people don't sit in detention centers for months on end, but be more effective in what they're doing. Next slide. Another thing that we need to consider, we need to be very careful about when we're talking or communicating about immigration issues, just like these people from the far right, the white supremacists and the nativists and anti-immigration people, they really crafted their messages looking at things like the need to control the population, and just all these little dog whistles and things to get many people convinced that, immigrants were a threat to us when actually they've been an asset to this country. They participate in less crime, and they are just very glad to be here in support of the government, on the whole. Not everybody, but they are. It's best not to talk about these negative myths because that reinforces what these people in the past have tried to do and then try to refute it, because what happens is the way our brains work, we remember that negative. We need to talk about these people in the terms of a need for equality and the fact if they become legal, they can develop business, they can work around more mobily, and we all can have a voice in building, a greater community, a better community. And this country, I think, has also talked about believing in the power and ability of redemption. And I think if we bring these people in the community, things will be more secure. And I think all that can be done. And again, you look at Biden's immigration law, there's a path to citizenship over 8 years, and people who've committed serious crimes, I mean, not the alleged, misdemeanors that we're calling aggravated felonies, but that can be addressed. But somebody who's been in prison shouldn't also then have the double whammy of being deported. If they've served their time, that should be it, instead of being picked up at the jailhouse and shipped out of the country. Next slide. This just gives an example of how to talk about it. So when it comes to immigration, we need common sense approaches that uphold our values, moves us forward. It needs to be fair and effective. Our current laws don't do that. There's no roadmap to citizenship for Americans, hasn't been one for aspiring Americans since 1972. And before that, even through some of the draconian laws we had before from the 20s to 1972, there still was a way for people to become citizens. And it talks about, dreamers and wrong-headed laws in places like Arizona, Alabama are ignoring basic principles of due process and fairness. And the other thing we've done with DACA is there's been some sort of criminalization of their parents. When you talk about somebody who's brought in against their will or unwittingly as a child, their parents still have rights and responsibilities in my mind, and they should not be considered part of the problem, but also part of the solution. Congress should pass the immigration reform bill and one of the action steps we're going to ask you to take is call and write your representatives and senators and tell them we need a modern and reasonable immigration process. I think it's important, even if your congressperson you would know would be supportive. I think in the New York area, that would be very much the case, but they still need to hear that we're on that page. And I think somebody in the group last week suggested, we need to talk to friends who live in other parts of the country. One of the things you need to consider with those friends are where on the spectrum of, like, I sort of consider myself pro-immigrant, and there are people who are strongly opposed at it. And there are people sort of along this spectrum. So people, sort of in the middle to this core belief, those are the people who can be persuadable. And you need to be countering these people at the other end, white supremacists, people very extreme anti-immigration people. Those people at this point, I don't think you need to focus on. You need to be able to sort of combat them with talking about things this way. And that's how we need to move forward. Next slide.